During a party at his mansion, the millionaire froze when he realized the waitress was wearing the same ring he had given his beloved before she disappeared over 25 years ago. He stepped closer and the crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the Anderson mansion's grand ballroom. Robert Anderson stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, nursing a glass of scotch as he watched his 50th birthday celebration unfold before him. The cream of Greenwich society mingled throughout the marble-floored space, their laughter and conversations creating a symphony of privilege that had long since become white noise to him. "Happy birthday, Dad," Michael said, approaching with calculated smoothness. At 22, his son was already a perfect product of their world: Harvard Business School, meticulously tailored suits, an ambition as sharp as the crease in his pants. The board members are impressed with the quarterly projections. Harrison mentioned he'd like to discuss the Asian expansion with you. Robert nodded absently. Later, perhaps. Michael's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted." "Just taking it all in," Robert replied, his eyes drifting past his son to scan the room. 50 years, half a century of achievements that looked impressive on paper. Anderson Enterprises had tripled in value under his leadership. The family portfolio now included properties across 3 continents, and his philanthropic foundation was praised throughout New England. Yet the empire felt hollow, built upon the foundations of a life he'd never wanted. Jennifer, his 19-year-old daughter, floated through the crowd in an expensive red dress, expertly navigating social connections like a seasoned admiral. She'd inherited her mother's beauty and social grace, along with something harder to define: a certain coldness behind the smile that reminded Robert painfully of Elizabeth. Elizabeth, his wife of 23 years, gone just 6 months now. Their marriage had been a business arrangement more than a love match, a fact they'd both acknowledged privately years ago. Her battle with cancer had been dignified and distant, much like their relationship. Robert had provided the best care money could buy, sat by her bedside when protocol demanded, but they'd remained strangers sharing a life until the end. "Mr. Anderson," a young server approached with a tray of champagne. "Would you like a glass for the toast?" "Thank you," Robert said, exchanging his scotch for the flute. As he reached for the glass, something caught his eye, a glimmer on the server's hand, a familiar green sparkle surrounded by diamonds. The room seemed to tilt. Robert's hand froze midair, his eyes fixed on the emerald ring adorning the young woman's finger. It couldn't be, but it was. The distinctive emerald and diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother. The same ring he had given to Emily Parker 24 years ago, on the night before she vanished from his life without a trace. "That ring," he said, his voice barely audible. "Where did you get it?" The young woman, her name tag read Olivia, took a startled step back. She was perhaps 23, with chestnut hair pulled back into a service-appropriate bun, but it was her eyes that struck him. Hazel eyes with flecks of amber, unnervingly familiar. "I'm sorry, sir." Her voice carried a slight nervousness. Robert composed himself, aware that Michael was watching the exchange with interest. "Your ring. It's quite distinctive." Olivia glanced down at her hand, a soft smile replacing her professional mask for just a moment. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed away." The floor seemed to drop from beneath Robert's feet. "Your mother?" "Sir, they're waiting for you for the toast," Michael interrupted. Placing a hand on his father's shoulder while giving the server a dismissive glance, Robert ignored him. "What was your mother's name?" Olivia's professional demeanor wavered under the intensity of his gaze. "Sarah, sir? Sarah Miller?" She hesitated before adding, "She died 3 years ago." "Miller." Robert repeated the unfamiliar surname. Not Parker, but that ring. There couldn't be two like it. His grandmother had commissioned it specifically from Cartier in 1925. "Dad," Michael insisted, his grip tightening. "Everyone's waiting." Across the room, Margaret Donovan, Robert's longtime assistant, was clinking a glass to call for attention. The guests were turning expectantly toward the center of the ballroom. "I need to speak with you," Robert told Olivia in a low voice. "After the party, please don't leave." Confusion flickered across her face, but she nodded before slipping away into the crowd with her tray. The next hour passed in a blur. Robert delivered a practice speech about gratitude and future endeavors, while his mind raced with possibilities. When the formalities concluded, He scanned the room for Olivia, but couldn't locate her among the serving staff. Looking for someone, Jennifer appeared at his side, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You seemed rather interested in that waitress." Robert met his daughter's calculating gaze. So much like her mother, missing nothing, always assembling the pieces into patterns that served her interests. "Just a business matter," he replied. "Business with the catering staff." She arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow. How innovative. Robert excused himself and made his way to the kitchen, where the catering manager informed him that Olivia Miller had clocked out early. Claiming a headache, he obtained her contact information under the pretense of discussing additional service opportunities and returned to the party with his mind reeling. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, Robert sat alone in his study, the contact information before him and a tumbler of scotch in his hand. The emerald ring gleamed in his memory. A ghost from the past somehow materialized in the present. Emily Parker, his first and only true love. The woman his family had deemed unsuitable for the Anderson heir. The night before she disappeared, he'd given her his grandmother's ring, promising to defy his family's expectations and build a life with her. The next day, she was gone, leaving only a brief note explaining she needed a different life than he could offer. He'd spent months searching for her before finally accepting his mother's advice that some people simply weren't meant for their world. 6 months later, he married Elizabeth Wilson in a society wedding that merged two Fortune 500 family empires. His future had been secured, just as his mother planned. Only now, 24 years later, the reappearance of that ring suggested a very different story. Robert picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Davis," answered a gruff voice. "It's Anderson. I need your services again." Robert took a deep breath. "There's someone I need you to investigate. Olivia Miller, 23, and her deceased mother, Sarah Miller." There was a pause. "Any particular reason?" Robert stared at the family portrait on his desk. Himself, Elizabeth, Michael, and Jennifer, all perfectly posed and immaculately dressed. A beautiful picture of a family built on a foundation of lies. "I believe she might be my daughter." 3 days after his birthday celebration, Robert sat in his mahogany-paneled office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, staring at the file Davis had just delivered. The investigator stood quietly by the door, waiting for his reaction. "This is all you could find on such short notice?" Robert asked. Flipping through the sparse pages, "Sarah Miller was careful about her digital footprint," Davis replied. "No social media, minimal public records. She worked as an elementary school teacher in Westport for the last 15 years, lived in a modest apartment, paid her taxes on time, model citizen, but practically a ghost." He paused. "The interesting part is that I can't find any record of Sarah Miller existing before 1999. Robert frowned. "Nothing at all. No birth certificate, no school records, nothing. It's as if she appeared out of thin air at age 25. Davis shifted his weight. Classic signs of someone who changed their identity. The words hung in the air between them. Robert's mind drifted back to 1999, calculating swiftly, 24 years ago. The timing aligned perfectly with Emily's disappearance, and the daughter, Olivia, born in 1999, raised by a single mother, graduated from UConn 2 years ago with a degree in social work, currently works at a community center while taking night classes for her master's, picks up catering gigs on weekends to make ends meet. Davis glanced at his notes. No father listed on the birth certificate. Robert stared out the window. His reflection superimposed over the city below. The man looking back at him appeared successful, confident, a titan of industry. No one would guess that beneath the tailored suit beat the heart of a man who had spent half his life wondering about a woman who vanished. "I'd like you to dig deeper," Robert said. "School yearbooks, old neighbors, anything. And I want DNA testing arranged, discreetly." Davis nodded. "I'll need something with her DNA. I'll handle that part," Robert replied, dismissing him with a gesture. After Davis left, Robert opened his desk drawer and removed an old leather journal. He hadn't looked at it in years, keeping it locked away like the memories it contained. Inside were photographs, ticket stubs, and handwritten letters, relics of his relationship with Emily Parker. He gazed at a photo of them from the summer of 1998. Emily's hazel eyes, the same unusual shade as Olivia's, sparkled with laughter as they sat on a beach blanket in the Hamptons. Her chestnut hair blew in the breeze, and her smile radiated a joy that Robert had never found again after she left. Unlike the women in his social circle, Emily had been refreshingly genuine. The daughter of a university professor. She'd been working as a museum curator when they met at a charity event. She'd called him out on a pretentious comment about a painting, and he'd been captivated by her honesty and intelligence. For 8 months, they'd existed in a blissful bubble. Robert had known his family wouldn't approve. The Andersons expected him to marry strategically, not for love, but he'd been prepared to fight for their relationship. The night before she disappeared, they'd had dinner at her small apartment. He'd given her his grandmother's emerald ring and promised that nothing would keep them apart. Emily had cried, saying she loved him too much to hold him back from his family obligations. He'd insisted that she was all the family he needed. The next morning, she was gone. The ring was left behind with a note. "I need a different life than you can give me. Please don't look for me." He'd ignored her request, spending months searching, hiring investigators, but eventually surrendered to the reality that she truly didn't want to be found. His mother had been surprisingly sympathetic, encouraging him to move forward and focus on the future of Anderson Enterprises. 6 months later, he'd proposed to Elizabeth Wilson after a corporate merger meeting. Their union, a perfect business arrangement. He'd been numb at their wedding, going through the motions of building the life others expected of him. A knock at his office door pulled Robert from his memories. "Come in," he called, quickly closing the journal. Martha Douglas entered, carrying a tea tray. At 70, the Anderson family's longtime housekeeper moved more slowly than she once had, but she'd refused Robert's offers of retirement, insisting the mansion was her home. "You missed lunch," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "You need to eat, Mr. Anderson." "Thank you, Martha." He smiled at her familiar fussing. She'd been with the family since before he was born, a constant presence throughout his life. Martha had always been kind to Emily during their relationship, one of the few household staff who hadn't treated her with thinly veiled disapproval. "Martha," Robert said suddenly, "do you remember Emily Parker?" The teacup in Martha's hand trembled slightly. "Miss Parker. That was a long time ago." "Yes, it was," Robert agreed, watching her closely. "I was just thinking about her." Martha busied herself arranging the tea things, avoiding his gaze. "She was a lovely young woman. I saw something recently that reminded me of her," Robert continued. "The emerald ring I gave her. My grandmother's ring." Martha froze momentarily, then resumed her tasks with forced casualness. "Did you now?" "Yes. Strange how objects can trigger such vivid memories." Martha straightened, her hands clasped in front of her apron. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Anderson?" "No, thank you," he replied, noting her obvious discomfort. "That will be all." After she left, Robert leaned back in his chair, contemplating the housekeeper's reaction. Martha knew something. He was certain of it. That evening, back at the Anderson mansion, Robert found Michael and Jennifer in the family room, engaged in a heated discussion that abruptly ceased when he entered. "Don't let me interrupt," he said, pouring himself a drink. Michael cleared his throat. "We were discussing the Campbell acquisition. Jennifer thinks we should wait until next quarter." "Is that so?" Robert raised an eyebrow at his daughter, who had zero interest in corporate strategy. Jennifer shrugged elegantly, just looking out for the family interests. She studied her manicure. "Speaking of which, what was happening with that waitress at your party? Michael mentioned you seemed quite interested." "Did he?" Robert gave his son a pointed look. Michael at least had the grace to appear uncomfortable. "You were acting strangely, Dad. I was concerned." "No need for concern. I simply recognized her jewelry." Robert took a slow sip of his scotch. "How much do you two know about your mother's family? The Wilsons?" The siblings exchanged confused glances. "Uncle Richard is Mom's only sibling," Jennifer offered. "Grandpa Wilson died before I was born, and Grandma Wilson passed when I was 5. "Why?" "Just curious about family history lately," Robert replied vaguely. "Turning 50 makes a man reflective." Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then stood. "I need to take this business call." After he left, Jennifer studied her father. "You're not telling us something." "There are many things I don't tell you, Jennifer," Robert replied evenly. "That's my prerogative as your father." She smiled, a calculating expression that reminded him painfully of Elizabeth. "Secrets have a way of revealing themselves, Daddy." especially in this family. As Jennifer glided from the room, Robert was left with the distinct impression that the comfortable predictability of his life was about to shatter. And he was the one holding the hammer. The small coffee shop on the outskirts of Westport was intentionally far from Robert's usual haunts. He arrived early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. When Olivia Miller walked in precisely at 10, her punctuality impressed him. She scanned the room, hesitating when she spotted him. "Thank you for meeting me," Robert said as she slid into the seat across from him. "Your assistant was quite persistent," Olivia replied, unwrapping her scarf, though she wouldn't explain why the CEO of Anderson Enterprises needed to speak with a catering server. Robert studied her face, searching for Emily's features. The shape of her eyes, the slight dimple in her left cheek, the way she tilted her head slightly when waiting for a response, all achingly familiar. "I apologize for the mystery," he said. "I wanted to speak somewhere private, away from prying eyes." "About what exactly?" Her direct approach reminded him of Emily's refreshing lack of pretense. A waitress arrived and they ordered black coffee for him, chai latte for her. Emily had always preferred tea to coffee. "The ring you were wearing at my birthday gathering," Robert began after the waitress departed. "It belonged to my grandmother." Olivia's hand moved instinctively to the emerald ring on her finger. "That's impossible. It was my mother's. Before that, it was Emily Parker's," Robert said softly. "I gave it to her the night before she disappeared from my life, 24 years ago." Olivia's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. "My mother's name was Sarah Miller." "Is this your mother?" Robert slid a photograph across the table. "Emily at 21. Laughing on a New England beach." Olivia's sharp intake of breath confirmed what he already suspected. Her fingers trembled as she touched the image. "Where did you get this?" "Emily and I were together for 8 months in 1998. My family disapproved. The Andersons had different plans for me than marrying a museum curator with no social connections." Robert paused as their drinks arrived. "She vanished without explanation. A few months later, I married Elizabeth Wilson, and we had Michael and Jennifer." Olivia stared at him, processing his words. "Why are you telling me this?" "Davis investigations confirm that Sarah Miller didn't exist before 1999, Robert said gently. "The same year you were born." Comprehension dawned in her eyes. "You think my mother was this Emily person, your girlfriend?" "I believe so, yes." "And you think—" She stopped, her face paling. "No, that's not possible. The timing aligns perfectly," Robert said. "And there's the ring, a family heirloom I gave only to Emily." Olivia stood abruptly. "My father died before I was born. That's what my mother always told me. Emily disappeared in February 1999. You were born in October," she whispered, then shook her head. "This is crazy. You're a stranger making wild claims about my mother. I'd like a DNA test," Robert said quietly. "If I'm wrong, I'll never bother you again. And if you're right," her voice carried both challenge and fear. "What then? You suddenly want to play daddy after 23 years. The question hung between them. What did he want? Confirmation, connection, redemption for failing to find Emily when she needed him most. "I want the truth," he finally answered. "After that, whatever relationship develops would be up to you." Olivia gathered her coat, visibly struggling with emotions. "I need time to think." "Of course." Robert handed her his card. "My personal cell is on the back. Call any time." After she left, Robert remained at the table, stirring his cold coffee absently. The meeting had gone better than expected, despite her understandable shock. She hadn't immediately rejected the possibility, which suggested she might have her own questions about her mother's past. 2 days later, Davis delivered the confirmation Robert had been both hoping for and dreading. Preliminary DNA analysis using a sample from Olivia's discarded coffee cup showed a 99.9% probability that she was his biological daughter. "Does she know?" Davis asked. "Not yet," Robert replied, staring at the report. "I'm waiting for her to contact me." Back at Anderson Enterprises, Robert approached Margaret's desk outside his office. "I need you to create a position," he said. "Community Outreach Coordinator. Salary commensurate with a master's degree in social work." Margaret raised an eyebrow but knew better than to question him directly. "Any particular candidate in mind?" "Olivia Miller. Arrange an interview but don't mention my involvement." Margaret nodded, making notes. Michael scheduled a budget meeting with you at 2. He's bringing the Asian expansion projections. Fine, Robert said absently, his mind already elsewhere. Inside his office, he called Martha at the mansion. Martha, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be honest with me. A pause. Yes, Mr. Anderson. Did you know Emily was pregnant when she left? The silence that followed was answer enough. Martha, please, Robert pressed. I can't speak of this on the phone, she finally said, her voice barely audible. There are complications you don't understand. Then I'm coming home now, he decided. This conversation is 24 years overdue. Before Robert could leave, Michael arrived for their meeting, walking in without knocking, as was his habit. Dad, we need to discuss these projections before the board meeting, he announced. Spreading documents across the desk, Robert remained standing. We'll have to reschedule. Something urgent has come up. Michael frowned. More urgent than a $200 million expansion? The board expects these numbers tomorrow. Nevertheless, it will have to wait. Is this about that waitress? Michael's expression hardened. Jennifer mentioned you've been distracted ever since your birthday. What's going on? My personal matters are not your concern, Robert replied coldly. They are when they affect the company, Michael retorted. You've missed 2 investor calls this week. Robert fixed his son with a stare that had cowed business rivals for decades. Don't presume to monitor my schedule, Michael. I built this company while you were still learning to tie your shoes. Michael's jaw tightened, but he backed down. Fine. Should I tell the board you're rescheduling, or shall I handle the meeting myself? You handle it, Robert said, gathering his coat. Consider it a learning opportunity. As Robert headed to his private elevator, he felt Michael's resentful gaze following him. His son's ambition was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Elizabeth had always insisted they give Michael and Jennifer every advantage, resulting in children who viewed privilege as a birthright rather than a responsibility. Perhaps that was about to change. At the mansion, Robert found Martha polishing silver in the dining room, a task she claimed calmed her nerves. You know, don't you? He asked without preamble. About Emily and my child. Martha set down the silver serving spoon she'd been polishing. Mr. Anderson, there are things from that time that are complicated. Then uncomplicate them, he demanded. Did you know Emily was pregnant when she disappeared? Martha nodded slowly. She confided in me. And you didn't tell me. The betrayal stung unexpectedly sharp. All these years, you knew I had a child out there. I made a promise, Martha whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She was frightened, Mr. Anderson, not of you, but of your mother and what the Wilsons might do. My mother, Robert echoed in disbelief. What does Margaret have to do with this? Martha glanced nervously toward the doorway. Your mother and Mrs. Wilson, Elizabeth's mother. They had plans for the families to merge long before you and Elizabeth ever dated. When Emily revealed her pregnancy to me, she was terrified. She'd received threats. Threats from whom? I don't know all the details, Martha said, wringing her hands. But she believed your mother and Richard Wilson were behind them. She fled to protect herself and the baby. Robert sank into a dining chair, his world tilting on its axis. Are you saying my mother and Richard forced Emily to leave? That they knew about my child and deliberately kept us apart? Martha nodded miserably. I helped her escape, Mr. Anderson. I couldn't let her stay. Not after what Richard threatened to do. Richard, Robert repeated, cold fury building within him. My brother-in-law, Richard. What exactly did he threaten? Before Martha could answer, the dining room door swung open, and Jennifer walked in, her timing as impeccable as it was inconvenient. There you are, Daddy, she said, then noted the tension in the room. Am I interrupting something? Martha quickly returned to her polishing. Just discussing the dinner menu, Miss Jennifer. Jennifer's sharp gaze flicked between them, clearly skeptical. Well, don't let me stop you. Although, Daddy, you might want to know that Michael just called, apparently. You left him to handle the Asian expansion presentation alone. He's more than capable, Robert replied tersely. Jennifer studied her father with calculating eyes. Something's going on. First the waitress. Now secret conversations with Martha. This isn't like you. Robert met his daughter's gaze evenly. There's a great deal about me you don't know, Jennifer. Now if you'll excuse us. Martha and I weren't finished. Jennifer raised her hands in mock surrender. Fine, keep your secrets, but Michael's furious, and you know how he gets when he feels slighted. After she left, Martha whispered, Please be careful, Mr. Anderson. The past doesn't always stay buried for a reason. The oak-paneled attorney's office felt suffocating as Robert stared at the leather-bound journal on the desk. Harold Burke, who had served as the family's personal attorney for over 30 years, cleared his throat nervously. I apologize for not bringing this to your attention sooner, Mr. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson left specific instructions that this journal was to be delivered to you 6 months after her passing, not a day earlier. Robert ran his fingers over the embossed initials. Ewa, Elizabeth Wilson Anderson. Though they'd shared a name and a life for 23 years, he'd never truly known his wife. Did you read it? Robert asked. Burke adjusted his glasses. No, sir. Client confidentiality extends beyond death, Mrs. Anderson was most explicit that only you should know its contents. After signing the necessary documents, Robert slipped the journal into his briefcase and left without further conversation. Instead of returning to the office, he instructed his driver to take him to the small park overlooking the Hudson, where he and Emily used to spend Sunday afternoons, seated on a bench with the October wind whipping around him. Robert finally opened the journal. Elizabeth's precise handwriting filled the pages, meticulous and controlled even in what appeared to be her most private thoughts. March 15th, 2023. The doctors have given me 3 months. Ironic that after a lifetime of careful planning, death refuses to adhere to my schedule. There are matters to be set right before I go, truths that must be told. Though I lack the courage to speak them aloud, Robert deserves to know about Emily Parker and the child. He has been a dutiful husband, if never a loving one. The fault for that lies partly with me. I entered our marriage knowing his heart belonged elsewhere, convinced I could earn his love over time. I was wrong. Mother and Richard assured me that Emily left willingly, that the pregnancy was merely a rumor. I chose to believe them because it served my purposes. Only later did I discover the extent of their deception and my own complicity by remaining silent. Robert turned the page, his hand trembling slightly. April 3rd, 2023. Richard visited today, ostensibly to check on my health. His real purpose was to ensure my silence extends to the grave, 24 years later, and he still fears exposure. Perhaps he should. What they did was unconscionable. When I confronted him about Emily Parker, he reminded me that certain sacrifices were necessary to protect the family legacies, as if threatening a pregnant woman was ever justifiable. I was too weak then to object. I am too weak now to make amends directly. This journal is my coward's confession. Robert closed the book momentarily, struggling to control his anger. The confirmation of Martha's story, that his mother and Richard had orchestrated Emily's disappearance, burned like acid in his chest. And Elizabeth had known, at least partially, all along, forcing himself to continue. He read through Elizabeth's detailed account of her discovery. 10 years into their marriage, she had found correspondence between Margaret and Richard discussing the Parker situation. Confronting Richard, she'd learned that Emily had been given a choice: leave with enough money to start a new life elsewhere, or face consequences. The pregnancy had indeed been real, and Richard had monitored Emily from afar to ensure she never attempted to contact Robert. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before Elizabeth's death, contained the most damning revelation. I've instructed Burke to include a DNA test authorization form with this journal. I know you'll want confirmation. Robert, the child, a daughter, according to Richard's sources, deserves to know her father, and you deserve a chance at the family you truly wanted. Her name is Olivia Miller. Sarah Miller was Emily's chosen identity. They settled in Connecticut, close enough to be within reach, but far enough to feel safe. I've enclosed the last known address from Richard's files. I cannot ask for forgiveness, only understanding that I was raised to prioritize family legacy above all else. Perhaps by revealing this now, I can finally free us both. Robert closed the journal, his mind reeling. Elizabeth had known about Olivia all along, had the information right at her fingertips, but chose to remain silent until after her death. The cowardice infuriated him, yet he recognized the courage it must have taken to leave this confession at all. His phone vibrated with an incoming call from Margaret Donovan. "Sir, Olivia Miller is here for her interview," she informed him. "HR is handling it, as requested." Tell them I'll be conducting the interview personally, Robert replied. I'm on my way. Robert arrived at Anderson Enterprises to find Olivia waiting in a small conference room, looking both professional and slightly uncomfortable in a Navy interview suit. Ms. Miller, he said, closing the door behind him. Thank you for coming. Olivia's surprise quickly shifted to wariness. I wasn't expecting you to conduct the interview. I apologize for the subterfuge. Robert gestured to the chair across from him. I thought you might refuse to see me otherwise. You're right, I would have. She remained standing. I'm not ready for this conversation. Please, Robert said. 5 minutes. Reluctantly, she sat. I've been doing some research on you. The great Robert Anderson, business tycoon. Your family has been in Forbes for generations. Don't hold that against me, he said, attempting lightness. My mother raised me to be suspicious of powerful men who suddenly appear bearing gifts or job offers. Olivia's gaze was steady. Why this position? Why now? Because you're qualified, Robert replied honestly. Your resume shows dedication to community service, and your master's work in social policy aligns with the foundation's goals. And the fact that you think I'm your daughter has nothing to do with it. Robert sighed. It has everything to do with it, but that doesn't make you less qualified. Olivia studied him for a long moment. I haven't decided if I want to know the truth. I understand. Robert slid Elizabeth's journal across the table. But I think you should read this before deciding. What is it? My late wife's journal. She died 6 months ago. Robert stood. Take it home. Read it. It answers questions I didn't even know to ask. As he turned to leave, Olivia's voice stopped him. Did you love her? My mother? Robert faced her, allowing the mask of corporate stoicism to fall away completely. She was the only woman I ever truly loved. Later that afternoon, Robert was reviewing contracts when Michael stormed into his office unannounced. You're hiring some random social worker as community outreach coordinator, without board approval. His son's face was flushed with anger. That position doesn't even exist in our organizational chart. It does now, Robert replied calmly. What's going on with you? Michael demanded. First you abandoned the Asian expansion presentation. Now you're creating jobs for waitresses. Mind your tone, Robert warned. Michael leaned on the desk. The board is concerned. Williams called me personally to ask if you're having some sort of midlife crisis. The board serves at my pleasure. Not the other way around, Robert reminded him. For now, Michael muttered. But if your behavior continues to erratic, careful, son. Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. Don't make threats you can't back up. A knock at the door interrupted their standoff. Jennifer entered without waiting for a response, immediately sensing the tension. Well, this looks fun, she commented dryly. What's broken this time? Dad's hired that waitress from his party. Michael spat. Created a whole new position for her. Jennifer's eyebrows rose. The one with the ring. Robert scrutinized his daughter's expression. You noticed the ring? Of course I did. Jennifer shrugged elegantly. Emeralds are my birthstone. It was quite distinctive. Not modern at all. Very similar to grandmother's in the portrait gallery, actually. The casual observation chilled Robert. Jennifer had always been more observant than Michael. More calculating. How much had she already pieced together? Mrs. Miller is highly qualified for the position, Robert stated firmly. Her employment is not open for discussion. This family doesn't keep secrets well, Daddy, Jennifer said, echoing her earlier warning. Never has, after his children left. Robert called Martha. I need you to locate my Aunt Susan, he instructed. Discreetly. Susan Morgan, his mother's younger sister, had been estranged from the family for years. If anyone might know the full extent of Margaret's involvement with Emily's disappearance, it would be Susan, who had always seen through her sister's manipulations. As Robert hung up, his phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. I've read enough. We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop, same time. Olivia. Robert stared at the message, hope and apprehension battling within him. After 24 years, the truth was finally emerging from the shadows, bringing with it consequences he could scarcely imagine. The Vermont countryside blurred outside the car window as Robert drove along the winding roads. Maple trees flamed red and gold against the October sky, a beauty he barely registered. His mind was consumed by the conversation with Olivia the previous day. "My mother told me my father died before I was born," she had said, clutching Elizabeth's journal. "She built our entire life around that story. Why would she lie to me for 23 years? Robert had no easy answer. Fear is a powerful motivator. If she believed you were in danger. From what? Your family. Olivia's incredulous laugh had held no humor. That sounds paranoid. I thought so too, until I read Elizabeth's journal. Robert had paused, choosing his words carefully. My mother and Richard Wilson, Elizabeth's brother, apparently went to extraordinary lengths to separate Emily and me. And according to Martha, there were threats involved. Now, as he approached the secluded property that had once been his family's summer home, Robert wondered what other secrets the old house might hold. His mother had sold the Vermont estate shortly after his father's death 15 years ago, but Robert had quietly repurchased it through a shell company. Unable to part with the childhood memories it contained, the caretaker, an elderly local man named Frank, met him at the gate. "Place is all opened up, Mr. Anderson, just like you asked, though I don't know why you'd want to visit in the off-season. Some business requires privacy, Frank." Robert handed him a generous tip. "I won't need any assistance today." The house stood as it always had, a sprawling colonial surrounded by maples and pines. Robert entered through the kitchen door, memories washing over him. Summers fishing with his father, holiday gatherings before the family fractured under the weight of expectations and appearances. He made his way to his mother's study, a room that had always been off limits to children. Margaret Anderson had conducted her social and charitable affairs here, maintaining the network of connections that positioned the Anderson family at the pinnacle of East Coast society. The built-in bookshelves still housed her collection of first editions. The desk remained positioned to catch the morning light. Robert began a methodical search, looking for anything that might illuminate the events of 24 years ago. The desk drawers contained nothing but old stationery and dried-up pens. The filing cabinet held only property records and charitable foundation documents. He was about to give up when he noticed a slight discoloration in the wood paneling behind the desk, a rectangular shape about the size of a safety deposit box. Pressing against various spots on the panel, he finally felt a subtle click. The hidden compartment swung open, revealing a small safe with a combination lock. Robert tried his mother's birthday, then his father's. Both failed. On a hunch, he entered the date Anderson Enterprises had gone public, and the lock disengaged. Inside lay a manila envelope labeled simply EP, Emily Parker. Robert's hands trembled as he removed the contents. Photographs taken with a telephoto lens. Emily entering an apartment building in 1999. Clearly pregnant. Emily pushing a stroller a year later. Emily and a toddler Olivia at a playground. The surveillance continued until 2008, when the images abruptly stopped. Beneath the photographs were handwritten notes exchanged between his mother and Richard Wilson. The Parker situation is contained. Monthly payments are being made through the Cayman account. She's agreed to the name change and relocation. Another note, dated 6 months after Emily's disappearance. R is still asking questions about E. The marriage to Elizabeth must proceed as planned. Too much is at stake. The most disturbing document was a typed agreement, unsigned but clearly intended for Emily, in exchange for financial support. $50,000 initially, followed by $2,000 monthly for 10 years. The undersigned agrees to 1. Legally change her identity. 2. Relocate outside of New York State. 3. Never contact Robert Anderson or any member of the Anderson family. 4. Never reveal the paternity of her child. Violation of these terms will result in immediate termination of financial support and other consequences. The clinical coldness of the document turned Robert's stomach. They had treated Emily like a problem to be managed, a threat to be neutralized. A final handwritten note from Richard to Margaret, dated 2008, confirmed the depths of their manipulation. Payments have stopped as scheduled. Parker, now using the name Miller, has maintained her end of the agreement for nearly a decade. I've destroyed most of the surveillance records as discussed. The enclosed photos are the only remaining documentation. E has built a quiet life as a schoolteacher. The child knows nothing of her paternity. Consider this matter permanently resolved. Robert sank into his mother's chair, rage and grief washing over him in equal measure. His own mother had orchestrated the separation from the woman he loved and his child. For what? To ensure the Anderson-Wilson merger proceeded as planned. His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Martha's name flashed on the screen. "I've located your Aunt Susan," she said without preamble. "She's living in a retirement community in Maine. I've texted you the address." "Thank you." "Martha," Robert hesitated. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Michael lately? Has he been asking questions?" "Mr. Michael has been spending considerable time in your late wife's study," Martha replied carefully. "He asked me for the key to her personal filing cabinet yesterday. Did you give it to him?" "I had to." "Sir, he is family." Martha's voice lowered. "But I thought you should know." After hanging up, Robert gathered the documents and locked the house. As he was pulling away, he noticed smoke rising from behind the property. Circling back, he discovered Frank standing beside a small bonfire. "What are you doing?" Robert demanded. Frank looked startled. "Mr. Wilson said you'd ordered a cleanup of old papers from the shed. Said it was all garbage that needed burning. Mr. Wilson, Richard Wilson, was here this morning before you arrived. Said he was acting on your behalf." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Did I misunderstand?" "Sir," Robert stared at the fire, watching as decades of potential evidence turned to ash. "What exactly did he burn?" "Boxes of old files from the gardening shed. Had your family name on them." Frank scratched his head. Seemed odd to store important papers out there, but he insisted they were worthless. Robert's jaw tightened. Richard was covering his tracks, destroying evidence of whatever scheme he and Margaret had concocted all those years ago. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Somehow Richard knew that Robert was getting close to the truth. As he drove toward Maine to meet his Aunt Susan, Robert's phone lit up with a text from Olivia. "Found something in Mom's old storage unit. Letters addressed to you that were never sent. She kept everyone." Robert pulled over, his heart racing as he read the next message. They're dated from 1999, 2001. "She never stopped loving you, whatever happened. It wasn't what you were told." He gripped the steering wheel, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. For 24 years, he'd believed Emily had chosen to leave. Now, piece by piece, the truth was emerging. A conspiracy far more sinister than he'd imagined, orchestrated by those closest to him. His phone rang again. "Jennifer." "Daddy." Her voice was uncharacteristically urgent. "You need to come home. Uncle Richard is here and he and Michael are having some kind of heated discussion in the library. I heard your name and something about damage control. Something's not right. Stay away from them," Robert instructed. "Don't let them know you called me." "What's going on?" "Daddy, does this have something to do with that ring? With the waitress you hired?" Robert considered how much to reveal. Jennifer had always been perceptive, perhaps too much so. "It's complicated," he finally said. "But yes, it's all connected. I'll explain everything soon, I promise." After hanging up. After, Robert texted Olivia, "Keep the letters safe. Don't tell anyone what you've found. I'm following another lead. We'll call you tonight." As he continued toward Maine, Robert reflected on how quickly his carefully structured life was unraveling. In just 2 weeks, he'd discovered he had a daughter, learned of a decades-long conspiracy involving his mother and brother-in-law, and uncovered evidence that the woman he loved had been forced away under threat. The pastoral beauty of rural New England seemed a stark contrast to the ugliness of the truth he was uncovering, a truth that threatened not just the Anderson family legacy, but the very foundation of everything Robert had built his life upon. Susan Morgan's retirement community overlooked the rugged Maine coastline. At 68, Margaret Anderson's younger sister had the same aristocratic bone structure, but lacked the cold calculation that had defined Robert's mother. "I wondered when you'd finally come looking for answers," Susan said, pouring tea into delicate china cups. Her hands trembled slightly. Betraying age, her posture defied, though I'm surprised it took 24 years. "You knew about Emily," Robert stated, watching his aunt's face carefully. "I knew Margaret was capable of extraordinary measures to ensure the family's social position." Susan's mouth tightened. "It's why I distanced myself from the Andersons. Your mother's methods were unconscionable." "What exactly did she do?" Robert asked, dreading the answer. Susan sighed deeply. "When she discovered Emily was pregnant, Margaret saw it as a threat to everything she'd planned. The Anderson-Wilson merger was her crowning achievement. Two of the oldest fortunes on the East Coast. Finally united, a middle-class museum curator with a baby on the way, didn't fit that narrative. So she forced Emily to leave, with Richard Wilson's help. Susan's voice hardened. Richard always had a certain ruthlessness that Margaret admired. Together, they presented Emily with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "The agreement I found," Robert said. "Financial support in exchange for disappearing." Susan nodded. "Emily initially refused. She loved you, believed you'd stand by her." She hesitated. "That's when Richard escalated the situation." "What did he do?" Robert's hands clenched involuntarily. "He threatened her directly, implied that accidents could happen to her or the baby if she didn't cooperate." Susan's eyes held genuine remorse. "When I found out, I confronted Margaret, but she dismissed it as unfortunate but necessary. That was the last time we spoke as sisters." The teacup in Robert's hand clattered against its saucer. "They threatened to harm my child, my unborn child. Margaret convinced herself she was acting in your best interest," Susan said, though her tone suggested she found the rationalization as hollow as Robert did. "The irony is, she genuinely believed you'd thank her someday for preserving your position in society. Did you ever try to find Emily? To warn me?" Susan looked away. "I hired a private investigator once, but the trail had gone cold. Emily Parker had vanished completely." She met his gaze again. "And you seemed to accept her departure so quickly. 6 months later, you were married to Elizabeth Wilson." The accusation stung, because it contained truth. Robert had surrendered to his mother's plans with minimal resistance, too heartbroken by Emily's apparent rejection to fight. "I've found her daughter, my daughter," Robert said. "Olivia, she's 23 now." Susan's eyes widened. "And Emily apparently died 3 years ago," Robert replied. "Though, given everything I've learned recently, I'm not even certain of that anymore." As they continued talking, Robert's phone buzzed repeatedly with calls from Jennifer, which he ignored. Finally, a text appeared. "Emergency. Martha's been in an accident. They're taking her to Greenwich Hospital. She was asking for you." Robert stood abruptly. "I need to go. My housekeeper's been hurt." Susan gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Be careful, Robert. If Richard feels cornered, there's no telling what he might do." The fluorescent lights of Greenwich Hospital cast harsh shadows as Robert strode through the emergency department. Jennifer met him at the nurse's station, her usual composure fractured by genuine concern. "She fell down the service stairs," Jennifer explained, leading him toward a curtained area. "The doctor says she has a concussion and a broken wrist. They're admitting her for observation because of her age." Martha lay small and frail against the hospital bedding, a stark contrast to the formidable presence she'd maintained in the Anderson household for decades. Her right wrist was encased in a temporary cast, and a bruise darkened her temple. "Mr. Anderson," she whispered when she saw him. "You need to be careful." "What happened, Martha?" Robert asked gently. "I was bringing linens down from the 3rd floor." Martha's voice was faint but urgent. "I heard Mr. Richard and your son arguing in the study when they realized I was in the hallway. Mr. Richard came out. He asked what I'd heard. I said nothing, but he didn't believe me." "Are you saying Richard pushed you?" Robert asked, rage building inside him. Martha glanced nervously at Jennifer. "It happened so fast." "I lost my balance." Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "Uncle Richard was at the house. We'll discuss this later," Robert told his daughter. To Martha, he said, "Rest now. I've arranged for a private room and a security guard at your door." In the hospital corridor, Jennifer confronted him. "What's going on?" "Daddy?" First the waitress with grandmother's ring, now Uncle Richard pushing Martha down the stairs. None of this makes sense. Robert studied his daughter, weighing how much to reveal. Jennifer had always been perceptive, but her loyalties were complex. Elizabeth had raised her to prioritize family position above all else. "It's a long story," he finally said, "and not entirely mine to tell. Does it have something to do with those old files Michael was looking through?" Jennifer asked. "He's been acting strange ever since your birthday party, secretive, having private calls with Uncle Richard." Robert's phone rang again. Olivia this time. "I need to take this," he told Jennifer. "We'll talk later." Jennifer's perfectly manicured hand stopped him. "Just tell me one thing. Is the waitress, Olivia, related to us somehow?" The directness of the question caught Robert off guard. Before he could formulate a response, a commotion erupted down the hallway as Michael burst through the emergency doors. "What happened to Martha?" he demanded, looking between them. "The house alarm company called me." "A fall," Robert replied. watching his son carefully. "Where's Richard?" Michael's expression flickered with something unreadable. "How would I know?" "You were meeting with him earlier," Jennifer interjected. "Martha overheard you." Michael shot his sister a venomous look. "Always the little spy, aren't you, Jen?" "Enough," Robert snapped. "Martha is injured, possibly deliberately. This isn't the time for your bickering." As they argued, Robert's phone continued to ring. Finally, he stepped away to answer. "Olivia, I can't talk right now. Someone broke into my apartment." She cut in, her voice shaking. "The place is trashed. The letters from my mother are gone." Robert's blood ran cold. "Are you safe? Where are you?" "At my neighbor's. I've called the police, but..." She broke off. "I'm scared. This is insane. Who would do this?" "I'm sending a security team," Robert decided. "Pack a bag. You're coming to stay at my house." "The house where your housekeeper just had an accident," Olivia countered. "No way. A hotel then. The Four Seasons in Manhattan? Under a different name. My security chief will arrange everything," after ensuring Olivia would be protected. Robert returned to find Michael and Jennifer in heated discussion. "Don't understand what you're doing," Jennifer was saying. "This isn't like you. You have no idea what's at stake," Michael hissed. They fell silent as Robert approached. "Michael, why were you meeting with Richard today?" "Family business," Michael replied evasively. "What kind of family business involves threatening an elderly woman?" Robert pressed. Michael's face flushed with anger. "I had nothing to do with Martha's accident, and I don't appreciate being interrogated like one of your employees." "Then start acting like someone worthy of trust," Robert replied coldly. "Someone broke into Olivia Miller's apartment today. Her mother's personal belongings were stolen. Know anything about that?" Michael's expression hardened. "You should be careful about accusations, Dad. They can have serious consequences." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them. Robert had never seen this side of his son before. Calculating, almost menacing, it reminded him disturbingly of Richard. "I need to check on Martha," Robert said, unwilling to escalate the confrontation in a public setting. "We'll continue this discussion at home." As Michael stalked away, Jennifer remained behind. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "I found Michael in Mother's study last week, going through her personal safe. When I asked what he was looking for, he said it was insurance for the future." Robert processed this new information. "Thank you for telling me. I don't know what's going on," Jennifer continued. "But Michael's changing. He's always been ambitious. But lately, it's like he's desperate." As Robert watched his daughter walk away, he realized the conspiracy didn't end with his mother and Richard. It had infected the next generation, poisoning Michael with the same toxic hunger for control and status that had defined Margaret's life. And now, with Martha injured and Olivia's evidence stolen, the stakes had escalated beyond family secrets to genuine danger. Whoever had orchestrated Emily's disappearance 24 years ago was willing to go to extreme lengths to ensure the truth remained buried. The Four Seasons penthouse suite offered both luxury and security. With Robert's private team positioned discreetly throughout the hotel, Olivia paced the living area, still visibly shaken by the break-in at her apartment. "This is insane," she said, for perhaps the 10th time. "Normal people don't have security teams and penthouse safe houses." Robert watched her from the sofa, struck again by how much her agitated gesturing resembled Emily's. "The Anderson family stopped being normal generations ago," he said. "It's not something I'm particularly proud of." Olivia paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. "I had a normal life 2 weeks ago. A job, an apartment, grad school, a dead mother I thought I understood." She turned to face him. "Now everything feels like some twisted soap opera. I wish I could tell you it will get simpler," Robert said honestly. "Tell me about her," Olivia requested, sitting across from him. "Not what happened at the end. I've pieced together enough of that nightmare. Tell me about when you knew her, when you loved her." Robert closed his eyes briefly, summoning memories he'd kept buried for decades. "She was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Brilliant, passionate about art history, completely unimpressed by the Anderson name or fortune." He smiled faintly. "We met at a charity auction. I made some pretentious comment about a modernist painting, and she called me out. Politely but thoroughly demolished my argument." "That sounds like Mom," Olivia said softly. She never backed down from a debate. She loved small adventures, taking the ferry to Staten Island just to try a specific pizza place, exploring forgotten corners of museums, finding poetry readings in Greenwich Village. The memories flowed more easily now. She had this infectious enthusiasm for experiences over possessions. It was revolutionary to someone raised in my world. And they took her from you because she didn't fit the proper social mold. Olivia's voice held equal parts incredulity and anger. The Andersons and Wilsons had planned our marriage, for years. Robert's mouth twisted bitterly. My mother viewed Emily as a threat to everything she'd orchestrated, and Richard, he hesitated, unwilling to describe the full extent of Richard's threats, was a monster, Olivia finished. Based on what Martha told you and what was in Elizabeth's journal. Robert nodded, then carefully extracted several documents from his briefcase. These surveillance photos confirm they tracked your mother for years after she left. They show you as a child. Olivia took the photos with trembling hands. "Oh my God," she whispered, staring at images of herself as a toddler, holding her mother's hand in a park. They were watching us the whole time. Until 2008 when the payments stopped, Robert confirmed. They had a decade-long agreement with your mother, financial support in exchange for her silence and new identity. And you never knew. All this time, I believed the lie they crafted, Robert admitted, that Emily had chosen to leave, that she'd aborted our child. I searched for months, but eventually, he shook his head. I surrendered to what seemed inevitable, married Elizabeth, took my place running Anderson Enterprises, buried myself in work to avoid facing how hollow it all felt. Olivia studied him critically. You could have looked harder. You could have found us. The accusation stung precisely because it contained truth. Yes, Robert acknowledged. I failed both of you. It's my greatest regret. Silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of absence. Finally, Olivia spoke again. In one of her letters, the ones that were stolen, Mom wrote that she almost contacted you when I was 12. She pressed her fingers to her temples. There was a school field trip to the Museum of Modern Art. Apparently, you were there for some donor event. She saw you from across the gallery but couldn't bring herself to approach. Robert remembered that day with sudden clarity. A strange moment when he'd felt someone watching him, turned to find only empty space. He'd dismissed it as imagination. How different might life have been if he'd turned a second earlier. The letters, Olivia continued. There were dozens of them, all addressed to you. None ever sent. She wrote to you through my childhood, updating you on milestones you missed, decisions she struggled with, sometimes defending her choice to stay away, other times questioning everything. She never stopped loving you, Olivia said, meeting his gaze directly. That came through in every letter. And she never told me who my father was because she was afraid, genuinely terrified, of what Richard might do if the truth came out. Robert's phone vibrated with an incoming call from Jennifer. He excused himself to answer. Daddy, Jennifer said without preamble. I found something. An old contact card in Mom's desk for someone named Helen Crawford in Oregon. There's a note on the back in Mom's handwriting. His new identity as of 2015. Robert's heart pounded. Are you sure that's what it says? Positive? Does it mean something to you? It might, Robert replied carefully. Jennifer, have you told anyone else about this, Michael or Richard? No, she said after a brief hesitation. Should I? Absolutely not. This is important, Jen. I need you to trust me right now. After hanging up, Robert turned to find Olivia watching him intently. What is it? She asked. A possible lead, he answered, from Jennifer. But we need more information before we pursue it. He hesitated. Martha might know more, but she's still recovering in the hospital. Olivia stood. Then let's go talk to her. Martha's private hospital room was guarded by one of Robert's security team, a precaution that no longer seemed excessive given recent events. She looked small against the white bedding, but her eyes were clear and alert. Ms. Miller, she acknowledged Olivia with a nod. You look so much like your mother. You knew her well? Olivia asked. Well enough to help her escape, Martha replied. When Richard threatened her, I couldn't stand by. I arranged a car, gave her cash from my savings, and connected her with my sister in California. Robert stared at his housekeeper in shock. "You never told me." "I promised Emily I wouldn't," Martha said simply. She was terrified, Mr. Anderson. Richard had evidence of previous incidents, people who'd crossed the Wilson family and suffered accidents afterward. Nothing that could be proven, but enough to convince Emily he was dangerous. But why did she stay away all these years? Olivia pressed. Even after she stopped receiving payments. Martha's expression softened. Fear becomes a habit, and protecting you became her life's purpose. She looked at Robert. "She did try to reach out. Once, after your father died. She sent a condolence card to the house. Richard intercepted it. Did you maintain contact with her after she left?" Robert asked. Martha nodded slowly. "Christmas cards mostly, using my sister as an intermediary, until about 3 years ago. When they stopped?" Olivia leaned forward. "That's when she supposedly died. But I'm beginning to wonder if her death was another deception," Robert finished. Jennifer found a note suggesting Emily might have created a new identity in 2015. Someone named Helen Crawford in Oregon. Martha's eyes widened. "Oregon," she whispered. "Emily always loved the Pacific Northwest. She talked about retiring to a small coastal town someday." "Do you think it's possible?" Olivia asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Could she still be alive?" "I don't know," Martha admitted. "But if she believed you were in danger from Richard, she might have gone to extreme lengths to protect you." As they absorbed this possibility, Robert's phone buzzed with an alert from the mansion's security system. Someone had accessed his private study using the master code, a code only he, Michael, and Jennifer possessed. "We need to go," Robert said. Showing Olivia the alert, to Martha, he added, "Say nothing about this conversation to anyone. I'll increase security here." In the hospital corridor, Olivia grabbed his arm. "What if she is alive? What if my mother has been out there all this time, thinking she was protecting me?" Robert covered her hand with his. "Then we'll find her. But first, we need to deal with whoever is searching my study, and make sure Richard can't interfere again." "And what if it is your son?" Olivia challenged. "Your own flesh and blood working against you." Robert's expression hardened. "Then he'll learn what happens when you threaten an Anderson, especially the daughter I just found." The Anderson mansion stood silhouetted against the twilight sky as Robert's car approached the winding driveway. Security footage from his phone showed Jennifer alone in his study, methodically searching through his desk. "At least it's not Michael," Olivia remarked from the passenger seat. "Jennifer has her own agenda," Robert replied, parking near the side entrance. "She's always been harder to read than her brother." They entered silently through the kitchen, where Robert retrieved a small handgun from a concealed safe. "Is that really necessary?" Olivia whispered, eyes wide. "After what happened to Martha, I'm not taking chances." He checked that the safety was on before tucking it into his jacket. "Wait here while I speak with Jennifer." "Not a chance," Olivia retorted. "I've spent my entire life in the dark, because people thought they were protecting me. I'm done with that." Robert recognized Emily's stubbornness in her expression, and nodded reluctantly. Together, they moved through the dimly lit hallways toward his study. Jennifer looked up sharply when the door opened, her hand freezing midway through a file drawer. Unlike Michael's calculated ambition, her expression showed genuine relief at seeing her father. "Thank God you're here," she said. "I've been trying to reach you." "By searching my private papers?" Robert asked coolly. Jennifer straightened, her gaze shifting to Olivia with undisguised curiosity. "I needed to find proof before they destroyed everything." "They, Uncle Richard and Michael." Jennifer closed the drawer. "They're planning something, Daddy. Something about controlling the company voting shares and..." Her voice trailed off as she stared more intently at Olivia. "You're her daughter. Aren't you, the woman in the photographs?" Olivia stepped forward. "You know about me." Jennifer nodded slowly. "Not until recently. I found old surveillance photos hidden in Mother's things after she died. A woman with a child. The dates on the back matched when Daddy was supposedly dating someone his family disapproved of." She turned to Robert. "I didn't understand the significance until I saw her wearing grandmother's ring at your birthday party." "Why didn't you say anything?" Robert asked. "I was waiting to understand what was happening." Jennifer tilted her head. "The Andersons taught me to gather all the facts before showing my hand." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Family motto, isn't it? Appearances above all." Before Robert could respond, The main door chime echoed through the house. "Are you expecting someone?" Jennifer asked. Robert shook his head, checking the security feed on his phone. "It's Michael, and Richard's with him." "Don't let them in," Jennifer urged. "Richard's dangerous. I heard him on the phone yesterday talking about handling the situation permanently if necessary." Robert's expression hardened. "No more running, no more hiding. It's time to confront this." He instructed the security system to admit them, then positioned Olivia behind his desk. "If anything goes wrong," he murmured, "there's a panic button underneath. Press it, and security will respond immediately." Richard Wilson entered first, his silver hair immaculately styled. Despite the late hour, at 62, he maintained the lean physique and cold confidence that had intimidated business rivals for decades. Michael followed, his expression a mixture of anger and apprehension. Family gathering. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes as he surveyed the room, lingering on Olivia. "How touching. And Mrs. Miller, I presume you're certainly the spitting image of your mother." "You'd know," Olivia replied coolly, "given how long you had her under surveillance." Richard's smile tightened fractionally. "Michael mentioned you'd been making some discoveries, Robert. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of my daughters," Robert replied, emphasizing the plural deliberately. Michael's face flushed. "This is ridiculous, Dad. You can't seriously be claiming some random waitress as an Anderson based on an old affair." "It wasn't just an affair," Robert said quietly. "Emily was the woman I intended to marry before she mysteriously disappeared, before your mother and uncle threatened her into leaving." "That's a serious accusation," Richard interjected smoothly. "One that would be difficult to prove after so many years." "Is it?" Robert removed the documents from his briefcase. "The surveillance photos you took, the financial agreements, Elizabeth's journal detailing your threats, Martha's testimony about helping Emily escape." Richard's composure wavered slightly. "Ancient history, even if true, the statute of limitations, doesn't apply to what happened to Martha yesterday," Robert cut in, "or the break-in at Olivia's apartment. You can't possibly think I had anything to do with—" "We found Helen Crawford," Jennifer interrupted, her eyes locked on Richard. "Mother's notes led us right to her. The new identity you helped Emily create in 2015 when you discovered she was still in contact with Martha." The color drained from Richard's face. It was a bluff. They hadn't actually located Helen Crawford yet, but his reaction confirmed their suspicions. "She's alive." "Isn't she?" Olivia stepped forward, voice trembling. "My mother isn't dead." The room fell silent as Richard calculated his options. Finally, he sighed. "This has spiraled out of control. I was simply protecting the family interests, as your mother asked me to, Robert. By threatening a pregnant woman." Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. "By forcing her to live a life of fear, separated from the father of her child." Margaret was adamant that nothing interfere with the Anderson-Wilson merger, Richard replied defensively. "The business implications were enormous. Surely you understand that family legacy sometimes requires difficult decisions." "Legacy," Robert laughed bitterly. "You destroyed the woman I loved, kept me from my child, all for stock portfolios and social standing." Michael stepped forward. "Dad, be reasonable. The Anderson name means something. Our position in society is meaningless compared to family," Robert finished. "Real family, Michael, not the artifice we've maintained for generations." "That artifice built your fortune," Richard snapped, dropping all pretense of civility. "That artifice gave you everything you have." "Not everything," Robert countered, looking at Olivia. "It cost me my daughter's childhood. It cost me 24 years with the only woman I ever truly loved." "Love?" Richard sneered. "Such a common sentiment. Your mother understood the bigger picture." "Where is she?" Olivia demanded. "Helen Crawford? Where is my mother?" Richard's expression hardened. "Even if I knew, why would I tell you? So you can dismantle generations of careful planning. So Robert can throw away his responsibilities for some romantic notion of—" "That's enough, Richard," a new voice interrupted. Martha stood in the doorway, supported by a nurse from the hospital. Despite her injuries, she radiated a quiet strength that commanded attention. "You should be in the hospital," Robert said, moving to help her. Martha waved him away. "Some things are more important than rest, Mr. Anderson." Her gaze fixed on Richard. I've kept silent for too long. No more. From her pocket, Martha withdrew a small digital recorder. After your threat yesterday, I thought it prudent to record our conversation. She pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room. If you say one word about Emily Parker or what really happened, I'll make sure you don't leave this house alive. It worked with her. It can work with you. The recording continued, detailing Richard's role in Emily's disappearance. The threats, and most damning of all, his admission that he'd orchestrated her second disappearance in 2015 when he discovered she'd been communicating with Martha. Your own sister-in-law was dying. Martha's voice trembled on the recording. Elizabeth deserved to know the truth before she passed. Elizabeth knew enough. Richard's recorded voice replied coldly. She understood what was necessary. Emily Parker needed to disappear again. Permanently this time. As far as her daughter knows, Sarah Miller died of cancer. That's the story, and it stays that way. As the recording ended, the room fell into shocked silence. You made me believe my mother was dead, Olivia whispered, tears streaming down her face. For 3 years, I've been grieving someone who's still alive. Richard's composure cracked. It was necessary. She was going to reveal everything, ruin decades of careful work. Where is she? Robert demanded, stepping toward Richard menacingly. Brookings, Oregon, Martha answered. A small coastal town. She works at a community center there under the name Helen Crawford. Michael moved suddenly, reaching inside his jacket. Robert tensed, hand moving toward his own weapon. But Jennifer was faster. She knocked her brother's arm aside as he pulled out not a gun, but a phone. Don't, she warned. It's over, Michael. It's never over, Michael spat. The Anderson legacy will continue, Robert interrupted, but built on truth from now on, not manipulation and threats. He turned to Richard. You have 2 options. Sign a full confession about your actions against Emily, or I release Martha's recording to the police and press. Richard's face contorted with fury. You wouldn't dare destroy your family's reputation. Watch me, Robert replied. The Anderson name means nothing compared to the people I love. As Richard stared into Robert's unflinching gaze, he finally recognized the truth. The power he had wielded for decades through fear and manipulation had evaporated. With a defeated slump of his shoulders, he nodded. I'll sign whatever you want, he muttered. But this isn't over. Yes, Richard, Robert corrected him. It is. The Anderson family attorney's office felt too small for the tension it contained. Harold Burke shifted uncomfortably behind his desk as he reviewed the documents spread before him. This is highly irregular, Burke said, glancing between Robert and Richard. Reading Elizabeth's will was completed months ago. What you read was incomplete, Robert replied. Elizabeth left additional provisions that were to be revealed only under specific circumstances. Richard sat rigidly in his chair. The confession he'd signed the previous night securely locked in Robert's safe. His usual commanding presence had diminished, leaving behind a man struggling to maintain the facade of control. Very well, Burke sighed, extracting a sealed envelope from his desk. Mrs. Anderson instructed that this addendum to her will be opened only in the presence of both Robert Anderson and Richard Wilson. In the event that information regarding Emily Parker or her child came to light, Michael, seated beside his uncle, scoffed audibly. Jennifer, who had chosen to sit closer to Robert and Olivia, gave her brother a warning glance. Burke broke the seal and began reading in his formal, measured tone. I, Elizabeth Wilson Anderson, being of sound mind, make this final confession as an addendum to my last will and testament. Should this document be revealed, it means the truth about Emily Parker has finally emerged. And for that, I am grateful, though I lacked the courage to reveal it myself during my lifetime. 24 years ago, I became complicit in a terrible injustice. My brother Richard and Margaret Anderson orchestrated the removal of Emily Parker from Robert's life upon learning of her pregnancy. While I initially believed Emily left willingly, I later discovered the extent of their manipulation and threats. 10 years into our marriage, I found correspondence between Richard and Margaret detailing their arrangement with Emily. When confronted, Richard admitted they had threatened harm to both Emily and her unborn child if she did not disappear. I chose silence to protect the family name and my position, a decision that has haunted me ever since. Burke paused, clearing his throat uncomfortably before continuing. As my final act, I have established a trust fund for Olivia Miller, born October 1999, the biological daughter of Robert Anderson and Emily Parker. The sum of $20 million is to be transferred upon verification of her identity. Additionally, my personal shares in Anderson Enterprises, constituting 15% of the company, are to be divided equally between my children Michael and Jennifer and Olivia Miller, giving each 5% ownership. Michael slammed his fist on the desk. "This is outrageous! Mother would never—" "Be quiet," Richard hissed. His face ashen, Burke continued reading. "Finally, I direct that all surveillance records, correspondence, and documentation regarding Emily Parker be turned over to Robert and Olivia without exception. Richard has maintained these records in a private safe deposit box at First Manhattan Trust, box number 4726, to which I am a co-signatory. I offer no excuses for my weakness, only this belated attempt at restitution, Robert. I hope you can find Emily and the happiness you deserved all along. To her daughter, I offer my profound apology for the years stolen from you." Burke set down the document. "That concludes, Mrs. Anderson's addendum. The trust fund paperwork requires Miss Miller's signature and will need DNA verification as specified." The room descended into tense silence, broken finally by Michael's bitter laugh. "So this is why you've been playing detective, Dad, a grab for more control of the company through your illegitimate daughter." "That's enough," Robert warned. "No, it's not." Michael stood, trembling with rage. "I've spent my entire life preparing to lead Anderson Enterprises. Mother promised me her shares would secure my position. And now you'll have to share," Jennifer observed dryly. "How tragic. You knew about this," Michael accused his sister. "That's why you've been so cozy with them," Jennifer shrugged elegantly. "Unlike you, I actually read Mother's journals after she died instead of just hunting for the will. She hinted at secrets involving Dad's past. It wasn't hard to connect the dots once Olivia appeared." "I don't care about the money or the shares," Olivia interjected quietly. "I just want to find my mother." Richard, who had remained unnaturally silent, finally spoke. "The Oregon information is outdated. Helen Crawford left Brookings 3 months ago." All eyes turned to him. "Where did she go?" Robert demanded. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "My last report indicated she'd closed her bank accounts and disappeared. Given her history, she's quite adept at vanishing." "You're lying," Robert said flatly. Richard's expression hardened. "Believe what you want. The truth is, Emily Parker has spent 24 years running and hiding. It's what she does." Olivia stood abruptly. "No, it's what you forced her to do. There's a difference." As the argument escalated, Burke's assistant entered with an urgent message. After reading it, Burke cleared his throat. "There's a situation developing at Anderson Enterprises, apparently. There's an emergency board meeting being convened. Called by you, Mr. Anderson." He looked questioningly at Robert. "I didn't call any meeting," Robert replied, immediately checking his phone. Multiple missed calls from Margaret, his executive assistant. When he returned Margaret's call, her voice was tense. "Mr. Anderson, the board has assembled at Michael's request. He's claiming you're mentally unfit to continue as CEO due to erratic behavior and neglect of duties. Richard Wilson is presenting evidence." "That's impossible," Robert said. "Richard is sitting right here with me." "Not anymore," Jennifer interrupted, pointing to the empty chair where Richard had been seated moments before. Michael smirked. "Uncle Richard recorded our little family gathering last night. The board will be fascinated to hear you threatening him, revealing company secrets to an outsider, and abandoning your responsibilities over some personal vendetta." Robert's mind raced. The board couldn't remove him immediately, but they could suspend him pending investigation, which would give Richard and Michael access to company resources, including the private investigators currently searching for Helen Crawford. "Go," Olivia urged. "Stop them. Finding my mother won't matter if they destroy everything you've built first." Robert hesitated, torn between his company and the search for Emily. "I'll continue looking for her," Olivia promised. With Jennifer's help, Jennifer nodded in agreement, surprising everyone. "Mother's final wishes deserve to be honored. I'll help Olivia while you handle Michael and Uncle Richard." Outside the attorney's office, Michael paused before getting into his car. "It's not personal, Dad. It's business. You taught me that. The Anderson legacy comes first. Family comes first. Robert corrected. "Something I failed to teach you properly. We'll see which the board values more," Michael replied. "Your newfound moral awakening, or 20 years of consistent profits under your leadership?" The Anderson Enterprises boardroom fell silent as Robert entered. 12 board members sat around the massive table, with Richard standing at the head, mid-presentation. A PowerPoint slide showing declining stock performance during Robert's recent absence glowed on the wall. "Robert," Richard recovered quickly. "We were just discussing some concerns about recent leadership decisions." "I'm sure you were," Robert replied, taking his seat at the opposite end of the table. "Just as I'm sure you mentioned your signed confession detailing decades of threats, coercion, and corporate espionage involving the Wilson family." Richard's confident smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Robert removed a document from his briefcase. "This confession, which I've had notarized and copied to my attorneys, details how you threatened Emily Parker 24 years ago, forced her into hiding, and orchestrated ongoing surveillance using company resources without board approval." The board members exchanged concerned glances. "Additionally," Robert continued, "it outlines how you conspired with my son to undermine my leadership based on personal vendettas rather than business performance." He turned to address the board directly. "Is this the type of leadership Anderson Enterprises wants to be known for? Threats, manipulation, and family vendettas? This is ridiculous," Michael interjected. "My father is having some kind of midlife crisis, inventing conspiracies to justify neglecting his responsibilities. Is Elizabeth's notarized testimony also an invention?" Robert countered, producing a copy of the will addendum. "Or Martha Douglas's recorded statement about helping Emily escape after Richard threatened her life." As uncertainty spread through the boardroom, Robert played his final card. "I've also taken the liberty of having our financial team audit all expenditures authorized by Richard Wilson over the past 24 years. They've identified over $3 million in unexplained payments from company accounts, funds used for surveillance and hush money, documented in Richard's own records." The oldest board member, James Harrington, who had served since Robert's father's time, finally spoke. "Richard, is this true?" Richard's composed facade cracked. "Everything I did was to protect this company. The Anderson-Wilson merger created one of the most powerful financial entities on the East Coast. I merely ensured nothing interfered with that legacy." The board's expressions shifted from confusion to disgust as the full implications became clear. "I move that we table this discussion of Robert's leadership," Harrington stated firmly, "and instead open an immediate investigation into Richard Wilson's misappropriation of company funds." As the motion carried overwhelmingly, Michael slipped from the room, his carefully orchestrated coup collapsing around him. Richard remained, his expression hardening into cold hatred. "You've destroyed everything we built," he hissed as Robert passed him. "No, Richard," Robert replied quietly. "I'm finally building something worth having." Outside the boardroom, Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "We found an address for Helen Crawford. Olivia and I are headed to the airport now. Oregon flight leaves in 2 hours. Meet us there." For the first time in 24 years, Robert felt a glimmer of genuine hope. The obstacles were clearing, one by one. Soon, he might finally come face to face with Emily again, if she was willing to be found. The coastal road wound through towering pines, offering glimpses of the Pacific Ocean between breaks in the forest. Robert navigated the rental car along the curves, while Olivia sat tensely in the passenger seat, and Jennifer studied the map on her phone from the back. "The address is just ahead," Jennifer said. "A small house overlooking the ocean." Robert slowed the car, his heart hammering against his ribs. After 24 years, a lifetime of regrets and might-have-beens, Emily, or Helen Crawford, as she now called herself, was potentially minutes away. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Olivia voiced the fear they all shared. "She created this whole new life, went to extreme lengths to disappear." "Because she was protecting you," Robert reminded her. "Not because she wanted to be alone." "Still, we're bringing back everything she ran from," Olivia countered. "Uncle Richard is facing criminal charges. Michael has practically disappeared since the board meeting. And the whole story will eventually become public. She deserves to make her own choice," Jennifer said quietly. with all the facts, not just the threats Richard used to control her. The GPS indicated they had arrived. A modest wooden house stood perched on a small bluff, its weathered blue paint faded from years of coastal storms. A winding path led from the gravel driveway to the front porch, which faced the ocean rather than the road. "It's exactly the kind of place she always talked about," Robert said softly. "Simple, surrounded by nature, with an ocean view." They sat in silence for a long moment, gathering courage. "Maybe I should go first," Olivia suggested. "Seeing you might be too shocking after all this time." Robert nodded, though it took every ounce of self-control to remain in the car. As Olivia approached the house, Jennifer squeezed his shoulder in a rare gesture of support. "You found her, Daddy," she said. After all this time, Robert watched Olivia hesitate at the door, then finally knock. Long seconds passed before it opened, revealing a woman whose silhouette was hauntingly familiar, even from a distance. The world seemed to stop as Emily, now with silver threading through her once chestnut hair, stared at the daughter she'd pretended to leave behind. Even from the car, Robert could see the shock on her face, the hand that flew to her mouth in disbelief. Olivia said something, and Emily's eyes darted toward the car. For one terrible moment, Robert thought she might slam the door, retreat back into her carefully constructed hiding place. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, one arm wrapped protectively around Olivia, her gaze fixed on the car where she somehow knew he waited. "Go," Jennifer urged. "She's waiting for you." Robert moved as if in a dream, crossing the distance between them with legs that felt suddenly unreliable. 24 years dissolved with each step, until he stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the only woman he had ever truly loved. "Robert," Emily whispered, her voice exactly as he remembered despite the years between them. "Emily," he replied, unable to form any other words. She descended the steps slowly, never breaking eye contact. Up close, he could see the changes time had wrought. Fine lines around her eyes, a certain weathered quality to her beauty, but her hazel eyes remained unchanged, still capable of seeing straight through to his soul. "How did you find me?" she asked. "The ring," Robert answered. "Our daughter was wearing your ring." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked between Olivia and Robert. "I never thought this day would come. I've imagined it 1,000 times, but never believed. Richard can't hurt you anymore," Robert assured her. "His threats, his power over you, it's finished." "Is it really?" Uncertainty clouded her features. "For 24 years, every time I thought it might be safe, something happened to remind me it wasn't." "It's over, Mom," Olivia said firmly. "We have Richard's signed confession, Martha's testimony, even Elizabeth's journal and will addendum. He's facing criminal charges." Emily sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed. Elizabeth knew all that time. "Not at first," Robert explained, joining her on the step, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the overwhelming urge to pull her into his arms. "She discovered the truth 10 years into our marriage but kept silent until after her death." A complex emotion crossed Emily's face, something between vindication and renewed grief for the years lost. "I tried to move on," she said softly, "to build a life for Olivia that was stable, safe. I told myself the lies were necessary, that revealing your paternity would only put her in danger. You did what you thought was right," Robert said. "Did I?" Emily looked out toward the ocean. "Or was I just a coward, letting fear control me for decades? There must have been another way, some solution that didn't involve a lifetime of deception. Richard threatened to kill you," Robert reminded her, "to harm our unborn child. There was nothing cowardly about protecting Olivia." Jennifer had approached quietly. Standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of this family reunion, Emily noticed her and straightened. "You must be Jennifer," she said. "You have your father's eyes, and my mother's tactical mind, unfortunately," Jennifer replied with a self-deprecating smile, "though I'm trying to use it for better purposes than she did." Emily's gaze softened. "Elizabeth wasn't a villain. We were all caught in Margaret and Richard's machinations, making impossible choices." The mention of Margaret reminded Robert of another revelation. "My Aunt Susan helped fill in many of the gaps. She suspected what my mother and Richard had done but couldn't prove it. She's eager to meet you both when you're ready." Emily looked between the three of them, Robert, Olivia, and Jennifer, as if still struggling to believe they were real. "I've lived as Helen Crawford for so long. I'm not sure Emily Parker exists anymore." "She does," Robert said, finally reaching for her hand. "She's right here." The touch of her fingers against his sent electricity through him, awakening memories of their last night together before everything fell apart. Emily seemed to feel it too, her breath catching slightly. "I tried to hate you," she admitted quietly, "when I saw the announcement of your engagement to Elizabeth 6 months after I left. It would have been easier if I could hate you. I looked for you," Robert said, needing her to know. "For months, not hard enough, clearly. But I didn't simply forget you. I watched you once," Emily revealed. "At the museum about 11 years ago. Olivia's class was on a field trip, and I volunteered as a chaperone. You were there for some donor event. I almost approached you, but then I saw you with Elizabeth and your children, looking so complete. I was never complete without you," Robert said simply. Olivia sat on Emily's other side, taking her mother's free hand. "No more running, Mom. No more hiding. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Emily squeezed her daughter's hand, then looked again at Robert. "And what does come next? We can't simply erase 24 years and pretend none of it happened." "No," Robert agreed. "But we can start from here, one day at a time." Jennifer cleared her throat. "Why don't I take Olivia into town for supplies? We passed a grocery store a few miles back. You two probably have a lot to discuss." After they left, Robert and Emily sat in silence for a long moment, watching the waves crash against the shore below. "Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?" Robert finally asked, the question that had haunted him since discovering Olivia's existence. "I was going to. That night I gave you back the ring," Emily replied. "But then Richard showed up at my apartment with photographs, evidence of what had happened to other people who'd crossed the Wilson family. He made it clear our child would never be safe unless I disappeared completely. I would have protected you both," Robert insisted. "Would you?" Emily challenged gently. "Against your mother, against the Wilsons. You were 26, Robert. Wealthy and privileged, yes, but still finding your place in that world. They would have crushed you, crushed us." The painful truth of her assessment hung between them. Robert had indeed been naive about the depths to which his family would sink to protect their interests. "I have the ring," Robert said, reaching into his pocket. "Olivia returned it to me." The emerald caught the afternoon sunlight as he held it up, still as brilliant as the day his grandmother had first worn it. "I gave this to you once, promising a future together," he said. "I'd like to make that promise again, if you'll allow it, not picking up where we left off. Too much has happened for that, but starting something new, with our eyes wide open this time." Emily looked at the ring, then at Robert, a lifetime of emotions crossing her face. "I'm not the same person you knew," she warned. "Neither are you." "No," he agreed. "We're both shaped by the choices we made and the ones that were forced upon us. But some things don't change, Emily. How I feel about you never did." She took the ring from his palm, studying it rather than putting it on. "I need time, Robert. This is overwhelming." "All the time you need," he promised. "I've waited 24 years. I can wait longer." Emily smiled then, her first genuine smile since they'd arrived, and Robert glimpsed the young woman he'd fallen in love with beneath the careful armor she'd constructed over decades. "Perhaps not too long," she conceded, closing her fingers around the ring. "We've lost enough time already." As the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, Robert and Emily talked, truly talked, for the first time in 24 years, about Olivia's childhood, about the empire Robert had built, about the lives they'd lived apart. With each story, each revealed memory, the chasm between them narrowed, not disappearing entirely, but becoming something they might eventually bridge together. When Olivia and Jennifer returned, they found Robert and Emily walking along the beach below the house, not touching but close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, two silhouettes outlined against the setting sun, finding their way back to each other after a lifetime apart.